Korchnoy POLUGAEVSKY, candidate semi-final match, July 1977. Report by Raymond Keene. Before I start on an analysis of some of the games from this interesting match, I'd like to make a few introductory comments. Now let's start by asking a simple question. What's so special about Viktor Korchnoy? He's a 46-year-old Soviet Grandmaster. He's reached the final of the Candidates Tournament twice, although he's not yet played a match for the World Championship. And as everyone probably knows, he defected from the Soviet Union in 1976 at the end of the IBM International Tournament at Amsterdam. In my opinion, Korchnoy's main ambition in life, it's not really a main ambition, it's an overwhelming ambition, is to win the World Championship in chess. And his defection had absolutely nothing to do with politics. It was a purely chess decision. In his opinion, it was impossible for him to become world champion if he stayed in the USSR. The only chance for him to become world champion was to move to the West and obtain completely new conditions for which to challenge for the world title. Now, at the end of 1974, Korchnoy played the candidates final against Karpov in Moscow, and the winner of this was to challenge Bobby Fischer. Well, Karpov won the match and Fischer didn't turn up, so Karpov became world champion. And in fact, this candidates final match became a de facto world championship contest. It was clear at the time, and I was there as a spectator in Moscow for the match, that the Soviet authorities very much wanted Karpov, the younger man, to win. All the older Soviet grandmasters, such as Petrosyan and Spassky, had tried against Fischer and failed, and Korchnoy had this taint of defeat about him as well, since he belonged to the older generation, although in fact in individual encounters he'd done quite well against Fischer. Anyway, Karpov had never even played Fischer, and it was very clear that he was the favourite to win, the political favourite, I mean. And during the match, Korchnoy experienced a kind of sharp practice being turned against him that made him feel that he didn't really have a chance to win. First of all, the audience was very much on Karpov's side. They tended to shout out things like, "Kill the bastard," "Push his teeth in," "Get him, Karpov," and things like that, while the match was going on, and this naturally put Korchnoy off. Secondly, the times of the games were put back from the normal regulation tournament times in Russia to a later time. Korchnoy protested against this because he felt it favoured the younger man, but his objections were overruled. Another thing that annoyed him was that both players were given official quarters during the match. Well, Karpov had a very nice hotel in Moscow, but poor old Korchnoy had to go and live in a sanitarium about 60 miles outside, and it took him over an hour to get into the match every day. And that's not really a very good idea when you're trying to win the World Championship. Finally, and this was the thing that irked him most, Karpov got an inordinate amount of help from the other Soviet grandmasters. There's a story that Tal got off a plane from a tournament during the match. A limousine, a Russian limousine I mean, rolled up at the airport. Someone dashed out and said, "Karpov's having trouble with the French defence. Get into the car and go to his hotel at once." And off Tal went. Well, that may be apocryphal, but it's indicative of the sort of thing that Korchnoy had to suffer. On his side, he could hardly get any decent help at all. A couple of masters, Ginji-Hashvili and Osnos, came forward to help him, and Bronstein made a few secretive telephone calls to him. But POLUGAEVSKY, who was his opponent in this candidate semi-final, although he offered some help, wouldn't even get out of his car when he came to visit Korchnoy, and Korchnoy had to analyse with him driving around the streets of Moscow. This is one of the reasons why Korchnoy accused POLUGAEVSKY of cowardice before they started playing their match in Evian. Well, this gives you some idea of why Korchnoy defected. He really wanted what he considered to be fair conditions for his World Championship bid, and he only thought he could do this if he played in the West. Another rather more devious reason is that Korchnoy felt that by defecting, he put a lot of political pressure on his Russian opponents when he played against them. Now, I don't know whether this was a conscious factor in his mind, but it was certainly a subconscious one. And at Evian, we noticed this. There was a lot of pressure on Polygaevsky to defeat Korchnoy and regain Soviet honor, so-called. And this pressure reacted in an adverse way and made Polygaevsky play much worse. After Korchnoy's defection, the Russian Federation tried to ban him from the candidates tournament. This move was successfully blocked by FIDE, but of course it added to Korchnoy's bitterness against his ex-colleagues. Now, you may ask, how on earth did I become his second for this match? It's pretty unusual for an Englishman to be a second in a World Championship contest. But in the past year, English chess has experienced a kind of renaissance. Now we even have 3 grandmasters. And I think that this achievement in being Korchnoy's second is partly connected with this upsurge in English chess. Well, I met Korchnoy at the tournament at Montreux just after he defeated Petrosian. And I asked him how the match had gone at Il Choco. This was the Petrosian match. And he told me that he had 2 seconds, the Israeli Murray, who is a master, and the Dutch international master, Hans Ree. But it seemed that the Western grandmasters he'd approached, I shan't mention any names, had been very reluctant to help him, possibly because of Soviet reprisals. I'm not quite sure what sort of reprisals they had in mind. Perhaps the terrible punishment of not being invited to Russian tournaments. But anyway, he'd approached 1 or 2 leading Western grandmasters, leading professional grandmasters, I mean, and hadn't turned up with much. Well, I felt this showed a rather despicable attitude on the part of our players, and I offered my services on the spot, which he gladly accepted. And once he'd accepted my services, I also suggested that he should take Michael Steen as well. Now, I've always had a high opinion of Michael's analytical powers, and I managed to convince Victor of this, and he soon agreed that Michael should come as well. This turned out to be a very wise decision. One of the great problems in a candidates match of this caliber is the analysis of adjourned games. And it's not just a technical problem, it's a physical problem. And Michael's only about 23 or 24. And to be frank, he gets tired less quickly than we do. Korchnoy is 46, as I mentioned before, and I'm almost 30. And if you have to stay up analysing all night, you really need a younger man as well. Even Murray, I think, is about 36. And the wisdom of recruiting a really young player for this kind of work became evident. Now, the venue of the match. It was arranged in July at the exotic-sounding Casino Royale Hotel, a plush 5-star residence in the French spa of Evian. The conditions for the match were really outstanding, and in my opinion they were much, much better than the conditions for the Spassky-Portish match, which was held just across the Geneva Lake in the town of Geneva itself. Now, the seconds for the other side, supporting Polygaevsky, were Bacherinsky, who's one of the leaders of the Soviet Chess Federation, Igor Zaitsev, a tactical maniac, Bagirov, a solid positional player with a good knowledge of opening theory. And I'm afraid that's all. You might ask why there wasn't a really strong grandmaster supporting Polygaevsky. Well, it seemed that Geller was asked to join Polygaevsky's team, but as a condition, he laid down 3 demands. The first demand was that his wife should accompany Geller to the match. Well, the Russian Federation agreed to that. The second condition was that he should get some good tournaments in the West as a reward for his labours. Well, They agreed to that too. That's not very difficult. But the third condition was the stumbling block. Giller wanted his son to go to university. Well, if you make Geller's son, you'll realize that's completely impossible. They turned that down. So, no Geller. Elsewhere in the bulletin that accompanies this taped report, you'll see some mention of the political negotiations that I conducted with Baczynski before the match began. These concern the flag, the suggestion of skull and crossbones, whether POLUGAEVSKY would attend the opening and closing ceremonies or other functions. The whole point of this, and these negotiations lasted for hours, was to try and unnerve Korchnoy before the match started. But in fact, since I had conducted the negotiations for Korchnoy, all the Russians succeeded in doing was putting intolerable pressure on POLUGAEVSKY. As an example of the pettiness that they went to, I even had to write a letter to the arbiter, Lothar Schmidt, to persuade the Russians to shake hands with Korchnoy. Luckily, Korchnoy himself behaved reasonably and rationally throughout all this. After all this strange behavior on the Russian part, I felt that Korchnoy's phenomenal performance in the match, winning 5 out of the first 7 games, was really a triumph for right. Perhaps that sounds a bit romantic, but it was a colossal achievement, and somehow I felt that it was justice winning. Once he'd scored these 5 victories almost in a row, with a couple of draws in games 4 and 5, it seems rather strange that he should have lost the 8th game and then only be able to draw the last few. I think the reason for this is that under the old rules, the match would have been over after 4 wins, and Korchnoy made 5 wins in the first 7 games, and he became extremely irritated that the match wasn't already over. And this irritation led to impatience and a feeling of frustration, and that's what let POLUGAEVSKY in with a kind of small chance at the end, though I'd say that he never really had any realistic possibility to pull back after his disastrous start. I think after this result that if Korchnoy can overcome the hurdle of Spassky, he'll have a very good chance against Karpov in the World Championship final. You may remember that Karpov defeated POLUGAEVSKY in the candidates' quarter-final in 1974, but it took him 9 games to score 3 victories, and he only scored his victories with white. But Korchnoy only needed 7 games to score 5 wins, and some of these were the black pieces. Well, the Karpov of 74 isn't the Karpov of 77, or even the Karpov of 1978, but just basing it on these statistics, I do think that Korchnoy will pose a real problem to Karpov, especially after the world champion's slightly substandard performance at the big tournament in Leningrad, which finished a couple of months ago. Finally, before I pass on to an analysis of the best games, I'd like to say what an inspiring person Korchnoy is to work with. He can provoke a kind of loyalty that most other chess grandmasters can't. And one thing I liked about him particularly was his love of the old master games. And we stayed up many nights analysing games by Lasker, Pillsbury, and people like that. And I really found this rather impressive. So many leading chess grandmasters now look upon chess as simply a way of travelling or widening their social horizons, or just as a way of earning money. But Korchnoy really loves chess, and I think that'll stand him in good stead in the future. Well, as I said, I'm going to analyse in detail the 3 games which I consider to be the best from this match. That's the 2nd game, the 6th game, and the 7th game. And we'll start off with the 2nd game. Here's the 2nd game. Korchnoy had already won the 1st game after a tough struggle, and you'll find that one in the bulletin. So for the second game, Polygaevsky was white, Korchnoy was black. The opening was a Queen's Indian defence, which in Grandmaster circles is a notoriously drawish variation. But watch how Korchnoy infuses some life into it. Here we go. White pawn to d4. Black knight to f6. White pawn to c4. Black pawn to e6. White knight to f3. That's a rather cautious move. The sharper alternative is to play white's knight to c3. And later on in the match, Polygaevsky was even successful by playing his pawn to g3 on the third move, going into a kind of Catalan opening. Okay, the Queen's Indian has long been a favourite of Korchnoy's, so not unnaturally his third move was black pawn to b6. Now white fianchetted his king's bishop to counter the pressure of black's queen's bishop. White pawn to g3, black bishop to b7, white bishop to g2, black bishop to e7, white castled, black castled, white developed his queen's knight to c3, and now black carried out one of the main strategic ideas of the opening. The point of the Queen's Indian defence is to control the e4 square with pieces, and this was the strategy worked out by its inventor, Aaron Nimzowitsch. So, not unnaturally, black's seventh move was knight from f6 to e4. By occupying this square with a piece, black is already fighting against white's plan of building up a broad pawn centre with pawns on c4, d4, and e4. In fact, later in the game, white succeeds in establishing this pawn centre, but by then black has already managed to inaugurate some kingside counterplay. Now, probably most of you know the main lines of the Queen's Indian, but in case you don't, and if this position is new to you, you might care to switch off for a while and think about white's next move. There are many alternatives, and almost any reasonable move you think of will have been played in a master game. But it could be of help, if you're a newcomer to this opening, to try and work out the best move. White's eighth move was queen from d1 to c2. The point of this is to fight, or to continue the fight, for the e4 square. Another possibility, please put white's queen back on d1 for a minute, is to play knight on c3 takes knight on e4, bishop b7 takes knight e4, knight on f3 to e1. But now there would follow bishop takes bishop, knight takes bishop, black pawn to d5, white queen to a4, and now a very fine move, black queen to e8. In this way, black manages to challenge the pressure from white's queen, and also keep a grip on the centre, especially over the e4 square. Although this kind of variation has occurred many times in Polygaevsky's games, he obviously didn't think it would bring anything against a master of Korchnoy's class, so he tried something a bit more aggressive. Please replace white's queen on d1, put black's queen back on d8, put the black pawn from d5 back to d7, put white's knight from g2 back to f3, put a black bishop back on b7, a white bishop on g2, a white knight on c3, and black's knight on e4. So, white's move was queen from d1 to c2. Black captured on c3 with his knight, and white took back with the queen. Of course, taking with the pawn would be stupid. It would simply leave white with very weak doubled pawns, but not much chance of starting an attack to compensate for this weakness. Now, once again, if you're a newcomer to this opening, you might care to consider what move black played now. There are three reasonable possibilities, but in view of what I've said about controlling the e4 square, that might give you a clue as to black's next move. Anyway, if you know nothing about this variation, switch off and take a think about it. Korchnoy's ninth move was black pawn to f5, which continues the struggle for the e4 square, without blocking the path of the black queen's bishop. Please put the pawn back on f7 for a minute. Other moves that are possible are black pawn from c7 to c5. Put the black pawn back on c7. Or black bishop from b7 to e4. Both of these moves are perfectly playable. So you don't lose any points if you thought of them. But Korchnoy's move is a little bit more aggressive. He maintains his grip over the e4 square, but he also sets in motion a gradual advance of his kingside pawns. Actually, his plan is rather risky, and it might have been safer to play bishop e4 or black pawn to c5. Please put black's pawn back on f5 and return the bishop from e4 to b7. Polygaevsky decided to fianchetto his queen's bishop. White's 10th move, white pawn to b3. Black bishop went to f6. White bishop went to b2. Black developed his queen's knight at c6. White reinforced his center by playing his queen's rook to d1. His queen's rook to d1. And black transferred his knight to the king's side, playing knight from c6 to e7. This is part of his plan to create counterplay by advancing his g-pawn and then playing the knight behind it. Black will then gradually advance his kingside pawns in a mass to counteract white's pressure in the center. Now Polygaevsky decided to fight for control of the e4 square so as to establish a broad pawn center. And his 13th move was knight from f3 to e1. The exchange of bishops will enable white to advance his e-pawn to e4. And there's not much black can do about this. So Korchnoy exchanged bishops. Bishop on b7 takes bishop on g2. And Polygaevsky took back with a knight. Taking back with the king is a bit silly, because the knight on e1 doesn't really have very many interesting possibilities. Whereas the knight on g2 can come to e3, for example, after white has pushed his e-pawn to e4. The fact that it doesn't in this game is simply a testimony to Korchnoy's very accurate middle game play. Now, once again, you might care to switch off and think about black's next move. I've dropped a lot of hints about what black's plan should be in this game, and now he carried it out. Although to inexperienced players it might look like rather a bold thrust. Switch off and think about it. Korchnoy's 14th move was black pawn to g5. He's following an old plan of Dr. Erver, which the ex-world champion elaborated in the early 1950s. Korchnoy and I had analysed this together before the match, but unfortunately, after 25 minutes of thought, POLUGAEVSKY now found rather a strong continuation, which we hadn't really analysed sufficiently beforehand. POLUGAEVSKY's 15th move, queen from c3 to c2. Black knight came to g6. The white pawn advanced to e4. And black started his kingside counterplay by playing his pawn from f5 to f4. White logically pushed on in the centre, with pawn on e4 to e5. Black's bishop retreated to g7. And now we reach a critical point in the game. White only has one move in this position, but it's rather a strong one. Switch off for a moment and see if you can find it. POLUGAEVSKY's 18th move should have been bishop from b2 to a3. That's a very deep move. The point of it is not just to attack black's rook, but to deny black's queen the e7 square. Now once black's queen can come to e7, he's at liberty to develop his queen's rook at peace. But if white takes this diagonal first, then it's very hard for black to coordinate his pieces. Of course, 18 bishop a3 is a difficult move to find, especially when they're attempting alternatives. And even after white plays it, it's not clear that he has an advantage. We only discovered this when we were analysing the game together in the post-mortem. Korchnoy relishes this kind of position. He likes to take risks, so he wasn't very concerned by this possibility. And in fact, in the game, white played a move that looked very powerful, but turned out to be stereotyped. Put white's bishop back on b2. POLUGAEVSKY's 18th move looks very nice indeed, but it doesn't really do anything. He played his queen from c2 to e4. Korchnoy quickly replied with queen e7, black queen to e7, seizing the vital diagonal. And now POLUGAEVSKY started to build up a massive central army. He played his rook from d1 to d3. Korchnoy developed his queen's rook at d8. Now, this appears to threaten black pawn to d6 or black pawn to d5. And POLUGAEVSKY, naturally enough, decided to stop it by piling up some pressure in the e-file. And his 20th move was rook from f1 to e1. Obviously played to prevent black's d-pawn from moving. What did Korchnoy do? He moved his d-pawn. And after this, I sensed, watching from the audience, that POLUGAEVSKY had lost the psychological battle. He played his 20th move to stop Korchnoy's 20th move, but Korchnoy played it anyway. That's a really humiliating thing to happen to a leading grandmaster. And after this, you could feel POLUGAEVSKY wilting. Black's 20th move, pawn to d5. White took on passant, e5 takes d6, and black took back with the queen. Now, this is what POLUGAEVSKY had missed. And this is a position where you can test your own tactical skill. What happens after queen takes e6 check? Please play queen takes e6 check on your board. Switch off your sets and think about what black will play. Okay, what did you find? White plays queen takes pawn on the e6 check. Black takes on the e6 with his queen. The white rook takes the black queen on e6. And now the trick. the black knight comes from g6 to e5. That hits white's rook on d3, but white can't take on e5 because of the pin in the d-file. And meanwhile, black's threatening to play king f7, winning white's stranded rook. That's precisely what Polygaevsky had missed. So the pawn on e6 is taboo. Please replace the pieces. Put the black knight back from e5 to g6, white's rook back on e1 from e6, black's queen back on d6, white's queen back on e4, and the black pawn back on e6. This resourceful tactical defense in a tense and difficult situation on the part of Korchnoy reminds me of Lasker, who, as I said before, is one of Korchnoy's heroes. So the game continued. The white rook on e1 went to d1. And now comes a very fine manoeuvre on Korchnoy's part. I won't ask you to guess it, it's too difficult. Nobody in the audience saw it either, and the audience included people like Dr. Erver, Lothar Schmidt, and one or two other grandmasters. Korchnoy very cleverly appreciated that once he gets the queens exchanged, he has slightly the better position because of his mobile kingside pawn majority and the slight weakness of white's d-pawn. I think you need a genius to see that in this position, and how to do it in the most efficient way. Black played queen from d6 to e7. No one understood this in the audience. We all thought that black would pile up his pieces in the d-file to attack white's d-pawn. Polygaevsky got his knight off g2, where he hasn't got any useful squares, and played it back to e1, which, as I mentioned before, isn't the most glorious square for the knight. Black's queen went to f6. This just looks like a feint against white's f2 square. So white defended, rook on d1 to d2. And now comes the real point. Black's queen went to f5. Now there's some danger that the queen might go to h3. And black might follow up with something like f3. Maybe not at once, but in the future. Also, it's difficult for white to defend his queen without getting his rooks into a tangle. So Polygaevsky took off on f5 at once. White queen on e4 takes black queen on f5. Now, here's another case where you might care to switch off and think about black's reply. Which way would you have recaptured? The most natural recapture is to take back with the rook on f8. Rook f8 takes queen f5, because that maintains the pressure in the f-file. But not Korchnoy. He saw deeper into the position than that. Put the black rook back on f8, and the white queen back on f5. He took back with the pawn. Black pawn on e6 takes queen on f5. Now black has double pawns. But Korchnoy saw that he could liquidate these double pawns, remain with the kingside pawn majority, and eliminate his own weakness on e6. Now black has a definite initiative, but it should still be possible for white to draw the game. However, Polygaevsky was suffering from shock, didn't find the best moves. There followed white knight to g2, black pawn to g4, an excellent temporary pawn sacrifice. White knight takes on f4, black knight takes on f4, pawn takes f4, black bishop to h6. White sees the e-file, rook from d2 to e2. Black regained his pawn, bishop takes f4. And now Polygaevsky committed another error. The best move would have been rook on d3 to d1, planning to double rooks on the e-file. Instead of this, he played rook from e2 to e6. This looks like a very aggressive move, but in fact it results in the loss of the e-file. Black's reply was rook on f8 to e8. POLUGAEVSKY quickly switched his rook from e6 to f6. But now comes the trick, something else that demoralized POLUGAEVSKY had overlooked. Black rook to e1 check, white king to g2, and now the other black rook slid across to f8. Black rook from d8 to f8, defending the black pawn on f5 from behind, but also having already allowed the penetration of one black rook right into the middle of white's camp. Now white's position is really looking critical. POLUGAEVSKY exchanged on f8, rook takes f8 check, king takes f8. And now his last chance of setting up a successful defense was bishop from b2 to a3 check, followed by pawn on d4 to d5. Instead, he played his moves in the other order. Put white's bishop back on b2. POLUGAEVSKY played his pawn from d4 to d5 at once. And now Korchnoy could have played to win a pawn, with rook on e1 to e2, white bishop to a3 check, black king to f7, white pawn to d6, bishop takes d6, white bishop takes d6, black pawn takes d6, white rook takes d6, black rook takes on a2. Now, this ending might be one for black. He's a pawn up, his king is quite well placed, and he has a kingside pawn majority, which hems in the white king. On the other hand, white obviously has some drawing chances, and white could have steered into this ending by giving the check with the bishop on his 34th move, instead of playing his pawn to d5. Now, please put the pieces back. Replace the black rook from a2 to e1. Put black's king back on f8. The white rook back on d3. The black bishop back on f4. The white bishop back on b2. The black pawn back on c7. White's pawns back on d5 and a2. So, on the 34th move, instead of going for the pawn win, Korchnoy, in time trouble, produced a brilliant move, bishop from f4 to d6. After this, white's virtually helpless. He can hardly make any constructive moves at all, because black's pieces are so well placed. Meanwhile, there's a terrible threat that black will advance his kingside pawns. In some cases, that might even deliver mate. The next few moves followed in a terrible time scramble. White bishop to c3, black rook to c1, white bishop to d2, black rook to c2, white pawn to a4. Now the rush starts. Black pawn to f4, threatening all sorts of horrors. White pawn to h3, black pawn to f3 check, white king to f1, black pawn to h5, white exchanged on g4, and black took back. POLUGAEVSKY now sealed 41, white king to e1, after no less than 45 minutes of thought. Steen, Murray and I analysed for several hours during that night, but we could find no defence for white to plans like black rook to b2, followed by an invasion of the black king. In fact, next morning, POLUGAEVSKY resigned the game without resuming play. Now, this might be a good moment to say something about what happened when games were adjourned in this match. The main session was played from 3 o'clock to 8 o'clock each day, and on the following day, if the game was adjourned, the adjournment session would also be played from 3 o'clock to 8 o'clock, and if the game wasn't adjourned, that would be a free day. Now, the broad technique of what occurred when we adjourned a game was as follows. Korchnoy would seal his move, or Polygaevsky would seal the move, and about 8 o'clock we'd all go for dinner. There'd be a general discussion over dinner with Korchnoy, Murray, Steen and myself. And about 10 o'clock, remember we were in France and dinner took rather a long time, we'd all go for a walk in the park surrounding the hotel. Then Victor would go to sleep. Steen and I would analyse the position together very carefully, and Murray would analyse on his own. Then we would come together during the night and compare notes. Then Michael or I would write down our conclusions and push them underneath Victor's door. Usually it's about 3 a.m. in the morning. The next day, at about 10:30 to 12:30, all of us, Korchnoy, Murray, Steen and myself, would analyse together and sort out the final version. Lunch was from about 12:30 to 1:30, and then Victor would sleep for an hour before each game. Well, that was the broad technique of our adjournment analysis. In this case, for Game 2, it was rather easy. There wasn't much to analyse. But in Game 6, we had some real headaches. After 5 games, Korchnoy was leading by 3 wins to 0 and 2 draws. So for the 6th game, we held a council of war and decided we could risk a bit of high adventure. An English defence. See the famous tape of the same name. Polygaevsky white, Korchnoy black. Here we go. White pawn to d4, black pawn to e6, white pawn to c4, black pawn to b6, the key move of the English defence. It invites white to set up a broad pawn centre, but black will rain hammer blows down on it. White's third move, pawn to e4. This was played with an air of disbelief by Polygaevsky, who obviously regarded black's setup as a bad joke in a candidates match. Black's third move, bishop to b7. And now, as I pointed out in my tape, there's an interesting variation. White knight to c3, black bishop to b4, white queen to c2, and then the black queen comes to h4. A bold but very strong move which exerts powerful lateral pressure against white's centre. I suggested this move to Tony Miles at the Haifa Olympiad last year, and he used it to beat the Hungarian Grandmaster Farago at Hastings 1966-67. Sorry, 1976-77, 10 years out. Incredibly enough, the whole idea had been found by the English player P.N. Wallace in the early 1970s, and maybe even earlier, but I was completely unaware of this when I rediscovered it. Anyway, put black's queen back on d8, black bishop back on f8, white's knight back on b1, and the white queen back to d1. Polygaevsky's fourth move was queen from d1 to c2. Clearly, he didn't want to have his queen's knight pinned, as in the previous example. But now came a move which rocked him in his seat. Of course, you know all about it, if you've read my tape on the English defence. Black queen to h4. Here, this is played in a slightly new position, but the strategic ideas are already well known, not however to Polygaevsky. He now found the rather timid knight on b1 to d2. Knight on b1 to d2. Black's bishop came to b4, pinning the knight anyway, but without the possibility of doubling white's c-pawns. White's king's bishop defended the e-pawn, bishop to d3, and black fires another shot at white's centre, black pawn to f5. Now, white's knight on g1 came to f3. The other one's pinned. There's only one knight that can go to f3. And Korchnoy played bishop on b4, takes white knight on d2, check. Now, the time has come to think about the position. Which way would you recapture? I suggest you switch off and think about this. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 possible recaptures. Let's take them in turn. Taking with the king on d2, white king takes on d2, is just plain silly. Black would play his queen to g4, threatening the pawns on e4 and g2, and white's game would collapse. Please replace black's queen on h4, white's king on e1, and the bishop back on d2. Okay, let's try taking back on d2 with the queen. White queen takes black bishop on d2. Once again, black plays queen from h4 to g4. And white's position, strangely enough, just falls apart, because he can't defend e4 or g2. Okay, try again. Black queen back to h4, white queen back to c2, black bishop back on d2. Now let's try knight on f3, takes black bishop on d2. Black's reply is knight on g8 to f6. And, oddly enough, white will have great difficulty in defending his e-pawn. It's attacked 1, 2, 3, 4 times, only defended 3 times, and it can't move or capture on f5. And if white tries to gain time by playing his knight back to f3, white knight to f3, then we have our old friend queen on h4 to g4, forking e4 on g2 yet again. Please replace black's queen on h4, put the black bishop back on d2, leave white's knight on f3, and put black's king's knight back on g8. So, there's one last possibility of taking back on d2. But POLUGAEVSKY had seen this trick of queen g4 in so many positions that he'd become thoroughly sick of it. Not just sick, worried, and he couldn't see an answer to it. In fact, in this position, white's only got one good move, and that is bishop on c1 takes the black checking bishop on d2. Once again, black plays his queen from h4 to g4. And now white has nothing for it. He has to sacrifice. Knight on f3 to e5. Black queen takes on g2. White castles queenside. Black pawn takes on e4. The white bishop goes to e2. Now in this position, white's given up 2 pawns already, and black can take some more if he likes. But he has good development and some attack for the pawns. For example, black's queen's in some difficulties, and his king's not yet castled. This is emphatically what POLUGAEVSKY should have played, and I think that if he hadn't been 3 points down in the match, with his confidence completely ruined, he'd have risked this sharp variation. I certainly recommend any white player to try this if they get the chance. Of course, the position's pretty unclear. Anything could happen. But this is the course that a courageous chess player should have taken. Now, let's put all the pieces back where they were before. Black's queen back to h4, white king back on e1, white queen's rook back on a1, white knight back on f3, black pawn on f5 from e4, white bishop from d2 back to c1, white bishop from e2 to d3, white pawns return to the board on e4 and g2, and black's famous bishop still alive on d2. Well, we've gone through 1, 2, 3, 4 possibilities of capturing on d2. 3 of them are just plain bad, and one of them is bloody risky, although white should have played it. What did Polygaevsky do? He played a move which nobody had seen. He didn't even take it. He played king from e1 to f1. Well, it's a very clever idea. He avoids all his queen g4 nonsense, and then he'll pick up the bishop while defending his pawn on e4. But in return for all this, he loses the right to castle, that allows his pawn structure to be shattered. This move, king f1, is really the move of a defeated and demoralized player, and I felt very, very happy when I saw it. So, the game continued. Black queen to h5. White bishop takes black bishop on d2. Black knight hops out to f6. Now white can't hold his e-pawn anymore. He wins a pawn, but his position gets smashed in exchange. Pawn on e4 takes pawn on f5. Black bishop takes on f3. White recaptures, g takes f3. Black developed his queen's knight with tempo, knight to c6, threatening all sorts of horrors. White bishop went to c3. That's clearly forced. And now Korchnoy could have tried to regain his pawns, perhaps by taking on f3 with his queen. That would obviously be very good. But instead he preferred to continue his attack and just continued the mobilization of his pieces. Black's 12th move, castles kingside. What an incredible position after 12 moves in a candidates match. It looks like a kind of crazy king's gambit with reverse colours. Almost all of black's pieces are developed. White's position is smashed, his king's in the centre. In fact, white's completely lost. It's really amazing. Many people were very much impressed by this game, which they said reminded them of Fischer. Well, I think it's even better than Fischer myself. There's another ironic feature about this position. Back in 1948, when the Soviet players were first gaining the world title, there was a lot of propaganda about the concrete appraisal of positions by Soviet grandmasters compared with their Western adversaries. For example, in the games of the 1948 World Championship tournament, poor old Dr. Erva and poor old Sammy Reshevsky were constantly being bashed for their stereotyped adherence to the value of the two bishops, when in certain key situations the two knights were really far superior. Well, I find it rather funny that Soviet Grandmaster Polygaevsky now has the two bishops and is being mown down by Korchnoy's knights. It's a kind of revenge. So, game continued. White's 13th move, rook to e1. Queen's rook to e1. Once again, black could regain his pawn by taking on f3 with the queen, and that's a perfectly good move. But instead Korchnoy played his queen to h3, check. White king went to e2. Black developed his final reserves, rook on a8 to e8. White's king fled the center, king to d1. Now another sharp blow, black pawn to e5. White captured, d takes e5. Black knight took on e5. Now, think about what happens if white captures the knight on e5. Turn off and work out the variations. They're not very difficult. If white plays bishop takes e5, there follows rook on e8 takes e5. White rook takes e5. Black queen takes pawn on f3 check. And the rook on h1 falls. Black has a winning game. Please replace black's queen on h3. Put white's rook back from e5 to e1. Black's rook back on e8. The white bishop back on c3. The black knight back on e5. And white's pawn back on f3. White's reply to knight takes e5 was bishop from d3 to e2. Now this allowed a neat combination which brings black a decisive advantage. Black knight from e5 takes white pawn on f3. Now this looks as if it loses. It seems that white can play queen from c2 to d3, which in fact he did, pinning the knight. It looks as if black's only reply is to retreat the knight to g5, but then white can exchange queens, and black's attack vanishes, and white is indeed left with the proverbial two bishops. But after queen d3, black has a very powerful combination. Turn off your sets and see if you can work it out. It's rather complicated, so don't be worried if you can't see it. Korchnoy's combination went as follows. Rook on e8 takes bishop on e2. If white now plays king on d1, takes rook on e2, there follows queen from h3, to h5, white queen takes the knight on f3, black rook to e8 check, and black wins. Please replace black's queen on h3, put white's queen back on d3, put the black rooks on e8 and f8, put black's knight back on f3, white's king back on d1, and the white bishop on e2. Black plays rook on e8 takes bishop on e2. White can't take with the king, as we've seen, and if he takes with the queen, black simply takes his rook on e1 and then picks up the white pawns. So, white's move was rook on e1 takes black rook on e2. And there followed the point of the combination, black queen to g2. Now white has to give back the exchange. Rook on h1 to e1, knight takes rook, king takes knight, and now Korchnoy could have won quickly by playing his queen to g1 check. The king must go to d2, and then queen takes pawn on h2. Black queen takes white pawn on h2. Now black is a pawn up, and white's position is smashed, and white can't get any counterplay by playing his rook to the 7th rank, because the f pawn is hanging and would fall with check. Please replace white's king on e1, put black's queen back on g2, and put white's h-pawn back on the board. Instead of this quick route to victory, Korchnoy played carelessly. He played his queen from g2, taking the white pawn on h2, and POLUGAEVSKY instantly replied, rook e2 to e7. Now white has definite counterplay, the point being that his f-pawn is already defended by the king. From now until the adjournment, although in terrible time trouble, POLUGAEVSKY played very well, and managed to bring about a drawish endgame. The next few moves were black queen to g1 check, white king to e2, black queen to g4 check, white king to e1, black pawn to h5, white queen to g3. A difficult decision to make, but it is the correct one. The exchange of queens eases white's task of defense. Black queen took on g3, pawn recaptured, black rook went to f7, white captured on f6 with his bishop, and black had to take back with the pawn. Rook went to e8 check, black king went to g7, white king came to f2, and Korchnoy tried to penetrate with his king, black king to h6. But POLUGAEVSKY cleverly constructed some counterplay on the queen's side. White pawn to b4, pinning down black's a pawn, Black king to g5, white rook to a8, king takes pawn, rook takes pawn, black pawn to d6, white pawn to a4, black king to e6, white pawn to a5, black took, and white took back with the rook. A good decision. Inexperienced players might have taken back with the a-pawn, getting themselves a passed pawn. But black could easily stop this by playing his rook behind the passed pawn, or by playing his king over via d7 and c6, and then white would really be suffering from weak pawns, as well as being a pawn down. Black's reply to rook takes a5 was pawn from f6 to f5, white pawn went to c5, white's correctly trying to eliminate the pawns, black rook went to h7, white exchanged on d6, and black took back with a pawn. White played his pawn to b5, and black played his pawn to h4. Really, black doesn't want to eliminate any more pawns, but he has to free his rook. And also this gives him two passed pawns to white's one. White took on h4, black recaptured, rook takes h4. The white rook went to a8. Black rook went behind white's passed pawn, the correct place for such rooks. The white rook went to b8, and black played his king to d5. Now, this is a terrible adjourned position. Polugaevsky seemed anxious to set up some kind of time record for sealed moves, since he had consumed 51 minutes over his sealed move, which was 42, king on f2 to f3, leaving himself with just over 8 minutes for 14 moves next day. Our adjournment analysis lasted all night, was very long and painful, but we couldn't find anything very convincing against the best sealed move, please put white's king back on f2, which was to play the rook from b8 to b6. And if black's king comes to c5, then rook to c6 check. And obviously, if black swaps pawns, he can't win the rook and pawn ending. Please put white's rook back on b8, the black king back on d5, and white's king back on f3. Even against king f3, we didn't find so much that was convincing. So, instead of playing the best line, which objectively led to a draw, Korchnoy tried a psychological blow. He played his rook from b4 to b3 check. Now it looks like nonsense to free white's king in this fashion, but Korchnoy was banking on the fact that Polugaevsky and his analysis team would have analysed the objectively best tries. Normally one doesn't want to free the opposing king in a rook and pawn ending, but now white's king is forced to advance up the board, which seems in his favour. Polugaevsky looked very, very confused and played king f4. Black played his king to c5, and now Polugaevsky could have made a draw by taking off at once on f5. But he was so confused by Korchnoy's strange moves that he gave a check on c8 with his rook first. Rook to c8 check. That's a losing blunder, and it's not very hard to see why. The remaining moves came quickly. Since Polugaevsky was in terrible time trouble, he couldn't pause to think, and Korchnoy just kept on banging out his moves instantly. The game concluded, black king takes pawn, white king takes pawn, black rook to e3. Oh dear, white's king's cut off. White king to f4, black rook to e1, white rook to d8, black king to c5, white rook to c8 check, black king to d4, white king to f3, black pawn to d5, white king to f2, black rook to e5, white rook to a8, black king to c3. White's rook hasn't got very much space, so it can't continue to check the black king for long. Anyway, Polugaevsky tried rook to a3 check, black king went to b4, rook to a1, and now the inexorable advance of black's d-pawn. Black pawn to d4, white rook to c1, black pawn to d3, white rook to c8, black pawn to d2, white rook checked on b8, black king came to c3, white rook checked again on c8, black king to d3, white rook to d8 check, black king to c2, white rook to c8 check, black king to d1. POLUGAEVSKY now fell into deep thought for half an hour and then resigned. I don't know why he thought for so long. This position's been known as a win for about 400 years. So that was the marathon 6th game. Now we'll go on to the exciting 7th to finish off this tape. Game 7, Korchnoy white, POLUGAEVSKY black, Queen's Gambit declined by transposition, Moran defense. White's first move, pawn to c4. Starts off as an English opening. Korchnoy always played this during the match. Possibly he was afraid of a Benko gambit or something if he played d4. Or maybe he just felt that the English opening was slightly less explored than 1d4, and this gave him a better chance to outplay POLUGAEVSKY in complications. But anyway, in this game we soon transposed back into a regular Queen's Gambit. Black knight went to f6, white knight went to c3, black pawn came to e6, white knight developed at f3. Now, during the course of the match, POLUGAEVSKY adopted 3 different moves at this point. Either he fianchetted his queen's bishop with 3, black pawn to b6, or he developed his king's bishop at b4, 3, black bishop to b4, or, as in this game, the 3rd game and the 5th game, he tried the Queen's Gambit. Black pawn to d5. 3rd move for black, pawn to d5. And now Korchnoy went straight into the Queen's Gambit. White pawn to d4. We had already envisaged this kind of possibility before the match, because this Moran defense, which soon arises, is one of POLUGAEVSKY's old favourites. Of course, black has many possibilities at move 4 in this position. He could develop his king's bishop at b4. He could try knight on b8 to d7, or he could play the semi-Tarrasch defense, 4, black pawn to c5. But as I said, the Moran has always been POLUGAEVSKY's favourite line. 4, black pawn to c6. Now white can try an interesting gambit by developing his queen's bishop at g5. When black has the choice of h6, attacking the bishop, or put the pawn back at h7, d takes c4, white pawn to e4, black pawn to b5, white pawn to e5, black pawn to h6, white bishop to h4, black pawn to g5, knight takes pawn at g5, black takes back, pawn takes knight, bishop takes pawn on g5. This is a very complicated position. It's hard to say who stands better, but personally I prefer white. Anyway, Korchnoy's lead in this match was so great that he never needed to resort to such sharp tactics right in the opening. Let's put the pieces back where they belong now. White bishop back from g5 to c1. Black pawn back from b5 to b7. Black pawn from c4 to d5. White pawn from e5 to e2. Black pawns return to the board at g7 and h7. White pawn back at c4. And the white knight back at f3. Instead of all this sharp stuff, Korchnoy played e3, white pawn to e3. Black played his knight from b8 to d7, and white played his bishop from f1 to d3. Black captured on c4 with his pawn, and white took back. Now we have a kind of queen's gambit accepted. The difference being that white has lost a tempo with his king's bishop. Normally it goes from f1 to c4 in one move. On the other hand, black is less well placed to attack white's centre, because he's already committed his queen's knight to d7, and he's wasted a move by putting his pawn at c6 rather than c5 in one go. On the other hand, black's structure does mean that he can make a quick advance of his queenside pawns. It's very difficult to say whether white has any real advantage, but if he does, it's because he has a solid central pawn wedge, which can advance and embarrass black's pieces, also creating some tactical possibilities against black's kingside. The game continued, black pawn to b5, white bishop to d3. Of course it could have gone to b3 or e2, but Korchnoy preferred to put the bishop on d3, and 3 games with this variation arose. The black bishop went to b7, white castled, black's pawn advanced to b4, attacking white's knight. We're still following the main line of the variation, and if you like you can check the way the other games went by looking at the bulletin, games 3 and 5 that is. Now on b4 the pawn could become a weakness, and as I pointed out in my note to the 5th game, there's an interesting pawn sacrifice against black's continuation in that game, which exposes the weakness of this pawn on b4. However, the nearer that we get to an ending, the more useful this pawn becomes. It pins down white's queenside a bit, and also the advanced black pawn on b4 could become very dangerous if black could threaten white's pawns on b2 or a2. Black could even lose a pawn, but the advanced nature of his advanced queenside pawns could bring him powerful compensation. This is one of the unresolved questions of chess. So, black's pawn went to b4, and now white has to decide where to put his knight. Switch off for a minute and see what you play. Of course, this is a question of taste. The only move that's no good, probably, is knight on c3 to b1, but even that's not clear, because the knight might re-emerge via d2 and b3. The main theoretical continuation is to put the knight on a4, but Giller played knight e2, followed by knight f4, against Andrew Whiteley in the European Team Championship at Moscow this year, and he won that game crushingly. Maybe that's even superior to Korchnoy's move. You can probably guess Korchnoy's move anyway by looking in the bulletin. He played knight e4. He always plays knight e4 in this position. There followed black bishop to e7, knight takes f6 check, knight takes f6, white pawn to e4, and black castled. That's much more sensible than rook c8, which was played in an earlier game. Now white played his queen to c2, threatening e5, so black played his pawn to h6, defending against the threat, and white developed his queen's bishop at e3, bishop from c1 to e3. This is an entirely new idea. It's a plan of Korchnoy's third, Yakov Muray. He came bouncing into our hotel room the morning this game was due to be played, and said, in Russian of course, "I've got this wonderful new idea. White has to put his bishop on e3 and then he gets the advantage." Well, we analysed it for a long time, and we couldn't find anything very wrong with it. And then Muray said, "Well, it's my birthday soon. Please play it as a birthday present." So, off we go, bishop e3. Actually, I'm not too convinced about the move, but it's not very charitable to criticise it after the event, especially since we couldn't refute it during our analysis. I'm afraid that over the next few moves, POLUGAEVSKY does a bit better than we did. Black rook went to c8. One of the annoying things about this variation from white's point of view is that most of black's good moves, are rather natural, obvious ones. So black doesn't need to think for a long time. The onus is on white to think and find new ideas. Black just puts his pieces on natural squares and plays for c5. And if white can't do something about this, then black will have the better game. White played his king's rook to d1. And, as expected, black played his pawn to c5, which Korchnoy took. Pawn d4 takes black pawn on c5. This isn't really a pawn sacrifice, but the reply, knight on f6 to g4. Now, while Michael Steen and I were watching this game from the auditorium, we had a nasty feeling that we hadn't analysed this idea. Or if we hadn't analysed it correctly. Of course, white has to play his bishop from e3 to d4. But now black has an excellent reply. Switch off for a minute and see if you can find what it is. Black's move is pawn from e6 to e5. And suddenly white's embarrassed. He's got a weakness at d4, c5, and f2. Even his queen is somehow, unfortunately, caught up in all these tactics. If white takes on e5 with his knight on f3 takes black pawn on e5. Black plays queen d8, takes bishop d4. White knight takes black knight on g4. And now black can take back on c5 with almost anything apart from the queen. And white's really embarrassed. Black's got terrible pressure, and the knight on g4 is looking very silly. Okay, please put black's queen back on d8. Put the knight back on f3 from g4. Put white's bishop back on d4, and black's pawn back on e5. And put black's knight back on g4. So, how does white resolve the dilemma? If he takes on e5 with his bishop, bishop d4 takes pawn e5. Black can take on c5 with either his rook or his bishop. They're both crushing. Taking with the rook is marginally more crushing, by the way. So, white bishop back on d4, black pawn back on e5. White's reduced to the miserable pawn to h3. Black took on d4 with his pawn. White took back on g4 with his pawn. And black played rook takes c5. It's also not bad to take on c5 with the bishop. Now let's stock take. Black's got the bishop pair. He's got a passed d pawn. He's got slightly better development. White has shattered kingside pawns. He doesn't have the bishop pair. His queen has to move. My feeling at the time was that black stood a little bit better, especially if he could take over the key dark squares on the king side, like f4. For example, if a black queen got to c7 and then came to f4, white would be in real trouble. On the other hand, there are certain advantages to white's position. First of all, the black d pawn might just be a weakness, as it can't be supported by another pawn. Also, white's massive kingside pawns on e4, g4, f2 and g2 might just advance and create tactical threats against black's kingside. All this comes to pass, mainly because Korchnoy played much more energetically than Polugaevsky in the ensuing complications. So, the white queen went to d2, queen from c2 to d2. That's a good move because it threatens to play g5 at some moment, not at once, but when black's pieces have moved away to defend his queen side. And Polugaevsky immediately played his pawn to a5. It's not clear whether that's the best defense for it. Another idea would be to play the queen from d8 to b6, not bothering about the pawn on d4, which might be sacrificed to create a pin on the d-file. Now white played his rook from a1 to c1, and Polugaevsky played his queen from d8 to d7. Now this really is a serious error. It's a very careless move. First of all, he allows his bishop to be drawn from e7 to c5, where it's on a very exposed square, and really accomplishing nothing at all. And secondly, he takes away all the defences against the thrust g5 by white. I think the most sensible course here would have been to exchange on c1. Now Korchnoy strikes, and suddenly a position that looked good for black a minute or two ago begins to look excellent for white. White rook takes rook on c5, black takes back, bishop takes rook, white pawn to g5, pawn takes, queen takes g5. That hits the bishop with tempo. There are now nasty threats like queen h5, e5, knight g5. Yuck. Black queen went to e7. He's got to challenge the queen with tempo. But now comes queen from g5 to h5. Threats knight g5, or e5. Black has to play g6. Pawn to g6. White queen to h6. Black queen from e7 to f6. Well, that stops the mating attacks for the moment, because the queen can always drop back to g7 and defend the important squares. But now Korchnoy moves in from a different angle. White bishop from d3 to c4. The way Korchnoy whips up an attack from this rather unpromising looking position a few moves ago reminds me of Alekhine. Normally his games remind me of Lasker, but this one's an exception. Now, switch off your sets for a minute and see if you can work out the obvious reply to bishop takes pawn on e4. Not hard, is it? If black plays bishop on b7 takes pawn on e4, knight g5 wipes him out. That's just to boost your confidence. Put the bishop back on b7. Knight back on f3. White pawn back on e4. Well, the interesting thing about this game is that POLUGAEVSKY didn't realise he was worse. In fact, my opinion was that he thought that Korchnoy's kingside attack was all sham, and really his possession of the bishop pair, remember my comments in the previous game, still gave him the advantage. And now he played the very vigorous move, pawn on d4 to d3. This opens a couple of dangerous lines. The bishop on c5 is bearing down on f2. Black's queen might slide into b2 and start a sideways attack. And meanwhile, if white takes the pawn with his rook, the bishop can hit e4 and gain tempo. At this stage, POLUGAEVSKY was even looking rather pleased with himself. Korchnoy played his pawn from e4 to e5. The black queen went to f5. And Korchnoy took the pawn on d3 with his rook. Now, before playing that move, I should point out that white can't move his knight to g5 yet, because the pawn on f2 would start to hang, followed by mate on g2. That's a very important point to bear in mind. The knight's pinned against the pawn on f2. So, white rook takes pawn on d3. And now the point of POLUGAEVSKY's defence. Bishop on b7 to e4. It suddenly looks as if Korchnoy's position's collapsed. If the rook moves away from the defence of the knight on f3, black simply takes it off, and there are terrible threats against f2. On the other hand, the only sensible square, or the only square at all, that defends the knight on f3 is b3, which is clearly absurd. White would soon lose his rook. When POLUGAEVSKY played bishop e4, he was beaming all over his face, and really looks as if he'd won the game already. But Korchnoy has a devilish trick up his sleeve. Turn off your sets and see if you can see what it is. Well, did you spot the devilish trick? 30, rook d3 to d6. Many exclamation marks. Poor POLUGAEVSKY turned quite green now, clutched his head in his hands, started swaying backwards and forwards. he suddenly realised that what he thought was a winning position is in fact a lost one. The point is that if he takes on d6, bishop c5 takes rook on d6, there's no longer any pressure against f2, so knight and f3 to g5 finishes the game on the spot. Please put the bishop back on c5. Please put white's knight back on f3, and white's rook back on d6. Secondly, if black carries out his threat against the white knight on f3, bishop on e4 takes white knight on f3, he undefends his pawn on g6, and white simply plays rook on d6 takes pawn on g6 check, and that's the end of that. You see there's a nasty pin of the pawn on f7. Put the black bishop back on e4, and white's knight back on f3. Now, you will see that black sacrificed a pawn for the attack, but actually white got the attack. And the most horrible threat of all is to put the rook from d6 to f6. That covers f2 from behind and opens the way for the knight to come from f3 to g5. I'm really quite surprised that POLUGAEVSKY managed to find any defence at all in this position. But he's a tough little guy. The black queen went from f5 to g4. Now it just remains for Korchnoy to find an accurate way of finishing off the game. White rook to f6. You don't need me to point out the threats for that move. The black bishop went to f5. And now a really sadistic move, white pawn to b3. Now black's virtually in Zugzwang. He can't move his queen's bishop, he can't move his queen, he can't move his rook, he can't move his king, so that leaves the king's bishop. Bishop on c5 to d4. Knight takes d4, queen takes d4, and now a rather obvious little combinative conclusion. But perhaps you'd like to switch off your sets for a while and see if you can work out the finishing stages. Korchnoy brought the game to a quick conclusion with rook on f6 takes pawn on g6 check. Ho ho ho, did you think you'd taken the bishop on f5? Well, that's good too, but this is a little better. Rook takes pawn on g6 check. Bishop takes g6. Queen takes g6 check. Don't forget the pin. King to h8. Queen to h6 check. King to g8. Pawn on e5 to e6. Now, if black takes the pawn on e6, pawn takes pawn, bishop takes pawn check, rook to f7, queen to g6 check, finito. Put white's queen back on h6, black's rook back on f8, white's bishop back on c4, white's pawn back on e6, and the black pawn back on f7. In reply to e6, black can't play his pawn to f6 or f5 because the white pawn will march on to e7 discovered check. So, last despairing try, black queen to e4, pawn takes pawn check, rook takes pawn, white queen to f6. Of course, bishop takes rook check wins as well, but this is the classy way of doing it. Black queen to b1 check, white king to h2, black queen to h7 check, white king to g3, black queen to d3 check. Well, one last chance to turn off your sets. Turn off your set and see if you can find white's next move. Of course, you don't play bishop takes queen. That would allow rook takes queen. Korchnoy played his pawn to f3, parrying check. Black played queen takes bishop on c4. Now the final move, queen to d8 check. POLUGAEVSKY resigned. If the rook goes to f8, the white queen goes to g5 check, and he takes the queen. That's the end of the most brilliant game in the match. And this is the end of the tape.